The room went quiet. Not the awkward kind filled with forced smiles and clinking silverware, but the kind that presses against your chest, the kind where even the air seems to pause and listen. Behind us, the television continued its low murmur. Then the anchor smiled, professional, polished, and said my name. Not the name they had laughed at an hour earlier, not the name they associated with cute little hobbies and polite nods. My name, followed by words I had never heard spoken out loud in my own home: founder. Global platform. Self-made millionaire. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I saw everything in the reflection of the glass cabinet across the room. My son-in-law's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His hand trembled slightly, as if his body had realized something before his mind caught up. Someone cleared their throat. Someone else shifted in their chair. And in that suspended moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. Some people only hear your voice once the world repeats it back to them. Before this story truly unfolds, let me say this quietly and sincerely. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving me your time, for choosing a story that isn't loud or flashy but honest. If you find yourself drawn to stories about resilience, dignity, and the quiet kind of strength that builds over years, I hope you'll stay with me, subscribe to this channel, and share this story with someone who might need it more than they admit. You may recognize parts of yourself along the way. My name is Eleanor Brooks. That Christmas evening, I sat at the far end of the dining table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my posture careful in the way people become careful when they don't want to take up too much space. Conversations flowed around me but rarely toward me. Laughter moved easily between my daughter Hannah, her husband Mark, and a few relatives who spoke to me the way one speaks to an old photograph. Fondly, distantly, without expectation. Mark leaned back in his chair, wine glass tilted between two fingers, wearing that familiar half-smile I had learned to read years ago. The smile that wasn't cruel but wasn't kind either. "So, Eleanor," he said, just loud enough to pull the room's attention toward me, "still working on that online sewing thing?" There it was. Not curiosity, not interest, amusement. I nodded gently. "Yes, still working on it." He chuckled, shaking his head slightly. "That's ambitious. I mean, online businesses are tough, even for people who actually grew up with technology." The table responded with soft laughter. Not sharp, not mocking. Worse than that, comfortable. As if his words had confirmed something everyone already believed. I smiled too. Over the years, I had learned that silence often preserves more dignity than defense. What makes this story different isn't sudden success or luck or revenge. It's about what happens when you stop asking permission to matter, when you let results speak instead of arguments, and when you learn the hardest lesson of all: being loved is not the same as being respected. 3 years earlier, I lost my job. 32 years as a public school instructor ended in a 15-minute meeting with carefully chosen phrases like restructuring and budget realignment. I remember nodding, thanking them, even apologizing, though I'm still not sure for what. I was 61, too young to retire, too old, it seemed, to be rehired. For weeks afterward, I woke up without urgency. No alarm clock, no lesson plans waiting on the kitchen table, no sense of being needed. Just quiet, thick, endless quiet. I filled that quiet with thread. Sewing had always been there for me. Late nights after grading papers, weekends when the house felt too empty. It was something I loved but never claimed. When friends complimented my work, I waved it off. When Hannah once suggested I teach classes, Mark had laughed and said, "Who's going to pay for that?" That sentence stayed with me longer than I ever told anyone. One night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with my laptop open and a cup of tea gone cold, I typed into the search bar, "How to teach sewing online." The results were overwhelming. Platforms, cameras, lighting, marketing terms I didn't understand. Exactly the kind of things Mark insisted were beyond me. I signed up anyway. My first class had 7 students. The camera angle was wrong. My hands shook when I spoke. I nearly quit halfway through, but something unexpected happened. I felt useful again. I listened. I adapted. I learned. Slowly, patiently, without announcing it to anyone, I didn't tell my family. Month by month, the numbers grew. Not explosively. Respectfully, students shared photos of their finished pieces, then their stories. Then they told their friends. What started as Stitch and Tell became Threaded Path Academy, a place not just for sewing, but for people who had been told they were too old, too late, or too invisible to begin again. By the second month, my inbox had become something I never could have anticipated. At first, I thought it would be a few polite notes from friends or acquaintances congratulating me on finally pursuing a hobby. But instead, it was a flood, a tidal wave, of messages, images, and stories from people whose lives had been quietly simmering in the background, unnoticed, unheard, and underappreciated. Some were retired, some were homemakers, some were people who had been laid off or abandoned dreams years ago. And almost all of them were nervous, hesitant, unsure if they deserved attention or even success. What struck me the most wasn't just their craftsmanship, it was their honesty. One woman in Portugal shared a photo of a small knitted sweater she had made for her granddaughter and admitted she hadn't touched a project in over 20 years, not because she had forgotten how, but because life had whispered repeatedly that her time had passed. Another man in Japan wrote a long, painstaking message about how he had started attending sewing workshops at his community center, never imagining he could actually sell his creations online. Each story carried a weight, a quiet longing, a hope that had been buried under decades of self-doubt, responsibilities, or the constant refrain of, "You're too late for that now." And that's when it struck me. This wasn't just about sewing. Not really. It was about giving people a voice through creation, a tangible expression that what they do matters, that they can contribute something meaningful even when the world tells them otherwise. It was about transformation, not just in skill, but in self-perception. Each person's growth, each small victory shared with me, was a ripple, an echo that I could see extending across continents. I realized, in a way I hadn't before, that what I was building wasn't a business, it was a lifeline, a bridge, a quiet rebellion against the idea that age, circumstance, or external doubt could define one's relevance. By the third week, I began to notice subtle changes in myself as well. Sitting at my laptop in the evenings, responding to messages and posting new tutorials, I no longer felt the hollow silence that had haunted the months after losing my teaching job. My hands, which had once trembled as I threaded a needle, now moved with confidence and purpose. I started leaving little notes of encouragement for my students. "Try it your way," or "Mistakes are part of the story," because I understood, profoundly, what it felt like to have no one say that to you when you were trying something new. These weren't just empty gestures. They were the beginnings of a community built on respect, support, and the quiet thrill of accomplishment. I want to pause here, if I may, and say thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be here, to read, to listen, to care. Choosing to spend this next hour with me means more than I can express. And if you find yourself drawn to stories about resilience, reinvention, and the strength that quietly builds over years, I ask that you subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and share this video with someone who might need it more than they admit. You are not just following a story, you are joining a movement that celebrates results, not excuses, courage, not comfort zones. And believe me, as you continue, you may see pieces of yourself in these narratives, hidden parts you thought were long gone. By the 6th week, it became impossible to keep calling it a hobby. I had upgraded my workspace. A corner of the living room turned into a small studio, complete with ring lights, a camera mounted on a tripod, and a neatly arranged backdrop that made the room feel less like a home and more like a place where something important was happening. But even more significant than the equipment was what I realized about the students themselves. They weren't just learning techniques, they were discovering themselves again. Each finished project, each photo shared in our online community was a story of resilience, courage, and quiet triumph. One student wrote, I feel like I'm finally claiming my own time, my own skills, my own life. And then came the hook, the moment that made my heart stop and my hands freeze over the keyboard. An email arrived from a woman in Ireland. She wrote in careful, almost trembling English, "Eleanor, I just sold my first handmade quilt online. I thought I was too old to start anything new. I've never felt this alive. Thank you for showing me it's not too late." I read it twice, then 3 times. It was tangible proof that what I was doing mattered far beyond my own expectations. That's when I realized the unique value of my platform. It didn't just teach skills, it validated dreams long abandoned, gave hope to the overlooked, and turned quiet determination into visible, measurable impact. In a world where people often only hear you once, others repeat your voice back to them, this was my chance to make sure people heard themselves first. The room smelled faintly of roasted turkey and cinnamon. It was Christmas Eve, and the soft glow of the chandelier reflected on the polished table, where family members sat exchanging small talk that felt rehearsed, like actors who had memorized lines they didn't believe in. I sat quietly at the far end, folding my hands in my lap, careful not to take up too much space. I had spent years learning how to inhabit a room without being seen. Tonight, I wondered if I had learned enough. Mark, my son-in-law, leaned back in his chair, wine glass precariously balanced between his fingers. He wore that familiar half-smile, the one that was neither cruel nor kind, but somewhere in between. He turned his head just enough to catch my eye and said, with a tone meant to amuse rather than inquire, "So, Eleanor, still teaching that online sewing thing? Or is it more like a hobby now?" A wave of déjà vu washed over me. I remembered the countless times similar questions had been asked with a laugh, a smirk, a glance that said, "You won't amount to much." But tonight was different. Tonight I wasn't invisible. Tonight my life had a voice that would echo back at them. "I am still teaching," I said softly, letting my hands rest calmly on the table. "And it's grown quite a bit." "Grown?" Mark's brow raised. A flicker of doubt, or perhaps recognition, crossed his face. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the soft murmur of the television behind us fill the silence. The news anchor's voice, professional and polished, cut through the room. And in our human interest story tonight, Eleanor Brooks, founder of Threaded Path Academy, has created a global platform teaching sewing and crafts to over 50,000 students in 47 countries. The platform has generated partnerships with major craft retailers and is valued at over $750,000. I watched the reflection in the glass cabinet. Mark's fork froze halfway to his mouth. His hand trembled subtly, betraying the shock that his mind had yet to process. A cousin cleared her throat. My daughter Hannah's eyes widened, and for the first time that evening, the room fell into a quiet that pressed against the chest, a silence heavy with realization. It hit me then, with crystalline clarity. Some people only hear your voice when the world repeats it back to them. The news segment continued, showing clips of my students' work, the bustling online classroom, and testimonials from people who had rediscovered confidence and skill through the platform. The anchor spoke of awards and recognition, of partnerships and revenue, but I didn't need to hear the words, I had already lived them. The impact was evident in every student's story, every photo, every message that had arrived in my inbox over the past months. Mark's expression shifted from smug amusement to something tentative, awkward, almost apologetic. That's impressive," he said, fumbling for words. I nodded politely. "Thank you." My tone was neutral, but my mind catalogued every micro-expression. Disbelief, surprise, a hint of envy. It didn't matter. Their recognition was no longer required. I had validation far beyond this room, far beyond their approval. Hannah leaned forward, breaking the silence. "Mom, we had no idea it had grown this much. This is incredible." Her voice was sincere, laced with awe. I allowed myself a small smile. "It's been a journey, yes, but what's important is the work itself. and the people we've helped along the way. Brina, my sister-in-law, cleared her throat. She glanced at Mark, then at me, eyes wide with realization. We really underestimated you, she admitted, voice small but earnest. It was a long time coming. Years of subtle dismissiveness, of comments about being past her prime or wasting her time, hung unspoken between us. And now, standing in the soft glow of the dining room, those years of doubt dissolved, not because of anger, but because results had a voice louder than skepticism ever could. The tension didn't evaporate entirely. Mark's ego bristled, and I could feel the wheels turning in his head. How to regain influence, how to manage the embarrassment of being so wrong. But I didn't offer an opening. I had learned over decades that acknowledging accountability is a choice, and respect is earned, not demanded. That night the family dinner continued, but the dynamic had shifted. I no longer sat as a silent observer, nor as someone tolerated for appearances. I was present, fully and without apology. Conversation flowed more carefully, but with a hint of curiosity and even admiration. My name, once whispered with amusement or indifference, now carried weight. Eleanor Brooks, founder, repeated in their minds and through the world, had changed the way I was perceived, and in that subtle, almost imperceptible shift, I saw the first glimmers of what this story was really about. Power doesn't always arrive in loud declarations. Sometimes it comes quietly, through persistence, resilience, and the courage to keep going. The first weeks after Christmas were a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. On one hand, I reveled in the quiet pride that came from seeing the tangible impact of my work, knowing that for the first time in decades, my life's labor had been recognized not just within the safe cocoon of my studio, but globally. Emails from students arrived like lifelines, filled with gratitude and excitement. Each message carried a spark. Hope rekindled, self-worth restored, confidence regained. Yet at the same time, the shift in family dynamics was palpable. Mark's occasional glances no longer carried amusement, they carried calculation. Brina's small smiles were tinged with uncertainty, as if trying to gauge how much my success might affect them, and then came the phone call I had anticipated but dreaded at the same time. It was Mark. His voice was careful, almost rehearsed, but beneath the surface I sensed the urgency. "Eleanor, we're in a bit of a tight spot," he began. "With expenses and everything, Brina and I were wondering if you might be able to help us, just until things stabilize." I listened, letting the words settle without responding immediately. I had expected this moment. The pattern was predictable. Whenever someone in my family faced difficulty, they instinctively turned to me not to discuss solutions, but to seek rescue. "I see," I said finally, my tone calm but firm. "Tell me exactly what you mean by tight spot." Mark swallowed audibly. "Well, we could use some financial support, maybe a few thousand to cover rent, utilities, and some bills. We'd of course pay you back once things improve." I took a slow breath. The words were familiar, yet each time they were uttered, the old weight of expectation pressed against me. But now, I felt something different. Clarity, rooted in experience and hard-earned self-respect. "I understand your situation," I replied. "But this isn't just about money, it's about patterns, and patterns have consequences." There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear Mark's mind racing, trying to find a loophole, a way to make this sound reasonable without facing accountability. "I'm willing to offer help," I continued, "but only under two conditions. First, you must attend financial counseling with a certified advisor. Second, any assistance will be tied to a plan that ensures you are living within your means. No exceptions, no shortcuts." Silence. Then, Mark's voice, hesitant but laced with frustration. "Financial counseling? Isn't that a bit much? I mean, it's just a few $1,000s. I shook my head, though he couldn't see me. "It's never just about the money," I said firmly. "It's about breaking a cycle of dependency. If we skip the structure, we're guaranteed to repeat past mistakes. I won't enable irresponsibility, but I will support accountability." Brena spoke up from the background, her voice quieter, tinged with guilt. "Eleanor, we really didn't realize I let her finish. I know I said, and that's why this isn't about blame, it's about learning, growing, and proving that you can manage responsibilities. If you choose to take the help without following through, the pattern repeats, and I won't participate in that." The following weeks were a test of patience. Scheduling the counseling sessions required negotiation, insistence, and occasional gentle coercion. Mark resisted, initially viewing it as a challenge to his pride. Brena wavered between support and hesitancy, but slowly the process began to take hold. The counselor emphasized budgeting, goal setting, and communication. They taught Mark and Brena to distinguish between a true financial emergency and avoidable overspending. I watched from the sidelines, cautious but hopeful. The shift was subtle at first. Mark began tracking expenses more diligently. Brena asked questions about cost-saving measures, and small victories like choosing to cook at home rather than eating out became celebrated achievements. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and real change was exactly what I had hoped for. Even as I offered support, I maintained boundaries. The conversation was never about control. It was about responsibility. I reminded them that financial help without accountability was like sewing a quilt without stitching the seams. It looked good from afar, but it wouldn't hold under stress. One evening, as I reviewed student feedback, Mark called again, nervously admitting he had taken the first real step, consolidating bills, cutting unnecessary subscriptions, and drafting a monthly budget. His tone carried the subtle relief of someone discovering competence they had doubted they possessed. "Mom, this is harder than I expected," he confessed. "But I think we can do it. I think I can do it." I smiled quietly to myself. "I knew you could," I said. "You just needed a framework." And sometimes, guidance is the difference between repeating old mistakes and creating new paths. The children noticed the changes too. Emma saw small victories bring joy, and I realized the lesson was taking root. Accountability works. The morning after Christmas arrived quietly, without ceremony. Pale winter light filtered through the curtains and rested on the kitchen floor like a promise that asked for nothing in return. The house was still, but it was no longer heavy. Something invisible had shifted, and everyone seemed to sense it. I moved through the kitchen slowly, preparing coffee, listening to the familiar sounds of a home waking up. Footsteps overhead, a door closing gently, the hum of the heating system. Ordinary sounds, yet each one felt different now, as though they carried a new kind of respect. At the table, conversations were softer, more deliberate. No one rushed to fill the silence. It struck me then how often noise is used to cover discomfort, how people speak not to connect, but to dominate. This morning no one felt the need to do that. Over the next few days the change became clearer. It wasn't dramatic or loud. There were no grand apologies or sudden confessions. Instead, there were small adjustments, questions asked with genuine curiosity rather than challenge, suggestions offered instead of instructions. For the first time in years, I was not being tolerated. I was being acknowledged. Messages began arriving in my inbox, not from strangers this time, but from people who had once dismissed my efforts. A cousin asking how the platform worked, a family friend wondering whether online education could apply to her own business idea. Even Mark, careful with his words, sent a short message congratulating me and asking how long it had taken to build everything. I read each message without urgency. There was no rush now. I had learned that when people suddenly notice your value, it often says more about their timing than your worth. The academy continued to grow. New students enrolled daily. Stories poured in from places I had never visited. People who had stitched together confidence along with fabric, who had rebuilt parts of their identity through learning something tangible with their own hands. These stories mattered more than revenue or recognition. They were proof that purpose, once aligned, creates momentum on its own. One afternoon, Hannah sat beside me as I worked on lesson plans. She watched quietly for a moment before speaking. She told me she had always admired my patience, even when she hadn't understood it. She admitted that she used to mistake silence for weakness. That admission stayed with me longer than any apology could have. Later that evening, I walked through the house alone. Photographs lined the hallway. Younger versions of myself stared back from frames, eyes filled with effort and uncertainty. I wished I could tell that woman what I knew now. That growth does not always announce itself. That strength can exist even when no one claps. That time has a way of revealing what persistence hides. By the end of the week, the family had returned to their routines. The house emptied, the noise faded, and life resumed its steady rhythm. Yet I remained changed. Not because others had finally seen me, but because I no longer needed them to. I understood something essential then. Power is not control. It is not volume. It is not dominance. Power is clarity. Knowing who you are when the room is quiet. Knowing your value when no one is watching. Knowing that your work matters even if the world takes years to catch up. This was not the end of my story. It was simply the moment I stopped waiting for permission to live it fully, and that I realized was the most valuable lesson of all. Time did not slow after that week. If anything, it accelerated. Days folded into each other, filled with quiet work and deliberate choices. I no longer measured progress by reactions or recognition. I measured it by alignment. When my actions matched my values, the pace no longer mattered. The academy reached milestones I once considered unrealistic. Enrollment crossed numbers that had once lived only in notebooks and late-night calculations. Yet success no longer felt like a destination. It felt like a responsibility. Every new student carried a story, a reason for arriving, a hope that deserved care rather than spectacle. I adjusted the way I worked. Less urgency, more intention. Growth without structure had once exhausted me. Now, structure protected the very thing that made the platform meaningful. I hired carefully, delegated slowly, said no without guilt. These decisions, once frightening, now felt necessary. There were moments when doubt returned. It always does. Late nights brought familiar questions, whether the momentum would last, whether relevance could fade as quietly as it arrived, whether the world would move on to something louder, faster, easier to consume. But doubt no longer paralyzed me. It had become a signal to pause, not retreat. One evening, I received an email from a woman in her 60s. She wrote about losing her husband, about the long afternoons that stretched endlessly, about discovering the academy by accident. She described sewing as the first thing that made time feel gentle again. She ended her message by saying that learning had given her days a shape. I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a long time. That was the moment I understood the true scale of impact. Not in numbers, not in valuation, but in how something created quietly could steady another person's life. Family dynamics continued to evolve. Some relationships softened, others remained distant. I no longer tried to repair everything. Not all bridges are meant to be crossed again. Peace, I learned, is not the absence of conflict. It is the absence of self-betrayal. Mark and I spoke rarely, but when we did, the tone was neutral, respectful. There was no need to revisit old tensions. Accountability had already done its work. Hannah grew more confident in her own decisions, less afraid of external judgment. Watching that shift felt like a reward I had not known to expect. As the year turned, invitations arrived. Interviews, panels, features. I accepted some, declined others. Visibility was no longer intoxicating. It was selective. I chose platforms that aligned with the same values I had built the academy on: depth over noise, substance over speed. One afternoon, while reviewing early course material, I came across my first recorded lesson. The lighting was poor, my voice uncertain, the content imperfect. I watched it all the way through, not with embarrassment but with respect. That version of me had shown up without guarantees. She had begun anyway. That was the real beginning. I realized then that most people wait for confidence before acting. They do not understand that confidence is a result, not a requirement. It grows through repetition, through resilience, through surviving moments when no one is watching. The world did eventually catch up. Recognition followed, Stability followed. But by the time they arrived, they were no longer the goal. They were simply evidence that consistency compounds. At the end of the day, when the house grew quiet again, I returned to the same truth that had carried me through years of invisibility. Meaning is built, not announced. Strength is accumulated, not displayed. And the most powerful transformations happen long before anyone applauds. This was not a story about proving others wrong. It was a story about finally standing in alignment with myself. And that, I knew, was where the story truly ends. The months that followed were quieter, but deeper. The academy thrived, reaching corners of the world I had never imagined. Students shared stories from distant cities, from small towns tucked between mountains, from apartments in sprawling urban centers. Each message carried more than gratitude, it carried transformation. I realized the academy had become more than a platform. It was a lifeline for people seeking to reclaim agency in their lives. Hannah had grown into a stronger version of herself. She no longer hesitated when she faced challenges. Watching her embrace life with determination reminded me of the woman I once was, the one who had quietly stitched confidence into every fabric of her existence without anyone noticing. Mark's demeanor shifted too. He was neither obsequious nor resentful. He had learned the hard way that respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through honesty and accountability. His small, careful gestures of acknowledgement no longer sought my validation. They were quiet nods to a truth he had learned too late, that my independence was not a threat, but a boundary he should honor. Brina's path had changed after her accident at work. She dedicated herself to helping others understand safety, responsibility, and the importance of knowing when to demand accountability. Her recovery was slow, but the lessons she carried were profound. Even the children, Emma and the younger cousins, had grown into keen observers of responsibility and persistence. Their curiosity no longer sought shortcuts. Their joy was in process, not instant reward. The legal case against the company responsible for the accident reached a conclusion. The settlement was significant, covering medical costs, lost wages, and punitive damages, but the true victory lay elsewhere. The family had been forced to confront patterns of dependency, to recognize the consequences of entitlement, and to step into accountability. Money, I realized, could never teach what experience and reflection could. The financial settlement was a tool, a framework to guide them toward independence. It was not the goal, nor was it the measure of success. I spent evenings in my studio, watching students log on from around the world. I observed hands at work, minds engaged, and lives quietly transforming. Each stitch, each creation, each success message felt like a reaffirmation of purpose. The platform had started as a simple effort to reclaim my own sense of utility, but it had become a testament to resilience, to human capacity to rebuild even when dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated. The family dinners that followed were markedly different. Conversations were more genuine, less performative. Respect replaced subtle condescension. I no longer measured their behavior against old wounds, nor did I seek proof of their growth. Their accountability had emerged through experience, not persuasion. And in that, I felt a rare kind of peace, the realization that the hard lessons we teach ourselves often ripple outward in ways we cannot predict. Recognition arrived from the outside world as well. Features in international publications, interviews on craft and entrepreneurship panels, invitations to speak and mentor. These moments were gratifying, but they were never the measure of my work. They were only markers along a journey defined by discipline, clarity, and integrity. Each accolade reminded me that authenticity resonates louder than spectacle, and that the quiet pursuit of excellence can eventually echo in places we never expected. On a crisp spring evening, I stepped into the studio to review the latest batch of student projects. Emma followed, curious and eager. She paused, looking at the tables of finished work, at the neat rows of fabrics and tools, at the digital gallery of progress. She turned to me and smiled. In that smile was understanding, A recognition that effort matters, that perseverance pays, and that learning is more than skill, it is character. I realized then that the story had come full circle. What had started as a private effort to reclaim purpose, to prove value to myself, had grown into a legacy of empowerment. It was no longer about recognition or approval, it was about impact. It was about creating a space where determination, patience, and quiet courage could flourish without apology. That night I sat at the window, looking out at the city lights scattered across the horizon. My thoughts were calm, my heart steady. I felt a profound sense of completion, not of endings but of cycles fulfilled. What had begun as resilience against doubt and dismissal had become proof that a single life, lived with intention, can transform countless others. I rose from the chair and walked through the house, listening to the quiet hum of life. The academy would continue, the family would continue to learn, and I would continue to do the work that mattered, not for recognition, not for approval, but because creating, teaching, and helping was my purpose.